Well, welcome, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us for Realities of Being an AAPI Artist.
Thank you for having me, Leianne.
Excellent. Chris, how would you regard yourself as an artist?
Probably one of the things that I found about myself is being able to tell a story and share it. Really, to me what an artist, the core of an artist is sharing. At least from my definition of an artist, sharing stories, sharing their experiences, um, sharing maybe their own outlook. So um, that's a very broad definition of an artist. Um, I am an artist by technical terms. I went to art school. I studied the arts, formally trained as an artist, and that's the technical aspect of it. But it's only one half of being an artist. The other half is really sharing. And I feel um, people who are songwriters share, and we call them an artist. People who do dance and they share are an artist. So, um, so maybe there are two things of looking at an artist. There's the technical part of it, and then there's the part that really engages their works.
Thank you. And inspired you to become an artist?
Hmm. I've always been drawing since I could remember. So I'll share a story of probably the very first time I could remember. And the story goes that the night before, I was very young. It was raining, it was storming, you know, it was loud. It was really loud thunder. Um, the next morning, I woke up and went to the front of the house with my dad, and we walked and looked at the house in front of me. And I started doing something for the very first time. One, I started drawing in the sand. And so my eyes were looking at the house and started drawing the triangle roof and the square house with the two windows, two big windows. And at that moment, I looked up and I think that was the very first time I ever saw my dad, like really consciously looking at him, seeing him. And then out of the window in the house, my mom comes out and I started doing something I'll probably will always remember is seeing my mom for the first time. And so I consciously started to draw my mom in the sand. And all of this came about really just by this marking in the sand, a house drawn in the sand. And to me, that was a conscious awakening, a visual awakening. Um, and so I think even early on, that was my very first memory. That is literally my first memory. And so memory and the visuals, they interlock together. Yeah.
Wow, that sounds like such a defining moment. And how old were you at that time?
I was probably 4, maybe 3, something like that. So
Wow.
to have a visual marker, which I created, and being able to see the eyes of my parents, and really simply by just looking and observing, that was probably the first form of act as an artist. And yeah, that's my story to share.
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. I think because at 4, at 5, people have um, very tough memories of during that time. And just to remember that, but the fact that you saw them differently as
Yeah.
as an uh a subject.
Yeah. Or like, what was I observing and why did it affect me like the next day, the night before I remember too. It was dark, it was raining, it was thunder. So something awoke me in the senses and it wasn't fear. It was just, loud thunder, lightning, bright lightning in the dark. So the next morning, uh, maybe having that experience the night before and remembering how soft the sand was in front of the house. Yeah, I mean, I could almost see the sand pebbles, right? So that to me is how important the visuals have been to me. And so, um, uh, yeah, yeah.
Wow, that's really neat. And you said you went to school for it, but how did you develop your artistic skills as a child and in your earlier years?
So, as I was younger, I was always drawing, doodling, maybe daydreaming, you know, maybe even, uh, you know, training my eyes to see things, you know. I think, moving to new places and, as young, as with young eyes, you're trying to observe. And so your eyes and your senses are trying to diversify and see what's out there. And it's really interesting because the world is, um, the sun comes up and the sun comes down. And in some cases, some people say, "Oh, it's like any other day. It's mundane." And I think mundane is a really interesting word. And mundane comes from the Latin word mund, M-U-N, which in Latin, mund is like the world, el mundo. So now the world, you could say, is repetitive. It sun rises, the sun comes down. But we all visually could say this world is not mundane. It is amazing. And so for me, for my eyes to see constantly the range and diversity of what's out there, the forms, I think that was probably the most uh, that most it affected me the most, seeing these forms, seeing trees, seeing even rivers and elements. And so, and then things that were man-made, right? And so the combinations of what we see in the natural landscapes and then the things that we make that are not natural, man-made, and in some case art. Art is also in Latin, it's used for art. The word is an artifact or artificial. In many ways, it's not the actual real thing. And so, um, you know, it's sort of reflecting back of what we see. And so I think as an artist, just like that little boy drawing a house in the sand, he's reflecting on what he's seeing. And I probably have been observing more than anything throughout when I was young and just drawing whatever I see. Whatever was in front of me, I would try to copy it or draw it. And um, understanding just drawing a tree is pretty miraculous. I mean, it's really a living thing. And so by no means do I ever underestimate or undervalue even a simple drawing of a flower, yeah, or a house.
Well, that's beautiful. And would you provide any advice for aspiring artists to develop their skills in that sense?
Yeah, I think so. Technical stuff, technical exercise is always good. And it's one thing that as an artist, if you spend hours on practicing, like like an instrument, or you are drawing, or the visual arts, that the technical aspects is that you actually have to learn and try to study it and try to observe what are the sort of the technical ways of approaching art making, a technical approach in visual making, technical approach of making anything. And so we have the technical terms to communicate and talk in language. Language is an art form. And so once we exercise, spend more time just almost doodling or just doing the exercise, and it will take it takes concentration, uh, and also meditation, right? Finding a place that you could find attention and focus, and also a place that fills a void. And when I mean fill a void, like knowing that maybe what we're all creating is a space, a place in between uh, of what you're looking at, what you're sensing, and you're putting it down. You're creating something in between. And so those are the stories I share. You know, those things that I share with. Um, so the part of hours and hours of exercise and practice, I encourage that. I definitely encourage that. And part of it then too is that like I could only talk in reference to how musicians are always studying every single note, and they read the notes and they play it on the piano, and they're reading the notes, and they are trying to coordinate their hands with the notes. And then at some point, after exercise of many hours or pure concentration, you start to read, and your hands and your body work together, and it becomes an instrument. And so, uh, to me, at some point, then too, the conscious to read actually goes away, and you start to create your work. Uh, it's funny because the moment a musician uh, starts to read the notes is when they start to mess up. After they've been practicing for hours on a piece, and then the moment they look up the notes, it throws them off. So yeah, I encourage the technical part of making art, just constantly making art, um, and not to put any value into it other than uh, creating, the act of creating, and the sort of result or whatever the outcome may be is not as important, you know, because you're not going to be able to write your uh, you're not going to be able to write a musical composition at first try. And so but also you become uh, more familiar also with your own uh, physicality, your own physical abilities, your own how you sustain it. You know, Ansel Adams is another example who was multi-artist in that he was a musician. He played the piano. All right. And the story is that he was the house piano player at Yosemite, and he was really good. He actually studied with some avant-garde pianists, Henry Cowell, and so. But as a musician, he was able to figure out his fingers and his movement. It's almost automatic. And so when he got a camera, and those cameras, you really have to know how to move your fingers to capture that moment. So how do we as artists capture that moment? So the technical part of it, how do you capture uh, a sunrise? You know, I mean, how do you capture that as a painter, as a visual artist, that moment? How do you capture something that's actually doesn't really exist even before your eyes? All right. And so there's ideas that you're trying to figure out how to create it. And so the technical part of exercise is important. Again, spending a lot of time in the studio or in a time of reflection and really putting down things like either be it a drawing or a composition, your writing. Uh, that's all important. I think and again, not looking for any results other than the technical exercise, which is important. And from there, the technical will help you springboard some of the more complicated ideas that one has. We are very complicated. A sunrise is very complicated. We will be happy to see a sunrise tomorrow. We will be happy to see a sunset. So there are moments as a visual artist, you realize, how do I capture that? Because as artists, it's complex systems are going through your mind. That's how I think as an artist. The drawing of the house in the sand wasn't just a house in the sand. It was probably the drawing of my own existence, of drawing my parents and drawing a place where I dwell, a place that maybe I felt safe and alive. And so I think that's important to be able to observe and then hope to have the technical aspect of being able to create it. And again, that to me is one advice I recommend is definitely the exercise, and because who knows where it'll take you. Ansel Adam could be a pianist, but he also became an amazing photographer, right? And so I think those are, and I also take art in a very holistic approach. And so, visual artists, maybe they're also dancers. Maybe we are all dancers and in movement. And so people say, well, I will say, a river dances, a river walks. Does the river ever sleep? Does the river ever exercise? And so I think for us, those are reflections that we have to think about in creating and moving stories, sharing stories.
Wow. That was beautiful, Chris. That's a completely new perspective. It's very enriching and on that side. So thanks for sharing that. Can you talk about some of the challenges that you faced as an artist in your career?
Mm-hmm.
How you overcame them?
Right. So one of probably the biggest challenge for an artist and for myself too is that how do I how do I unlearn what art is? One of the things is that you're an artist, you're supposed to create new things, new art, new perspective. So unlearning what art is a challenge. And so I had to unlearn what being an artist was supposed to be. I thought when I went to college, okay, I'll go to art school. Maybe I'll get a studio afterwards and I'll become an artist. Yeah. And so even that image, that idea of an artist working in the studio was something I've had to unlearn through time, through uh, failures and trials and tribulations, and understanding that idea of what I thought what an artist ought to be doing has changed and evolved into something more, what I feel more genuine and honest, because I was thinking what art ought to be. And so, or and even what an artist ought to be. And so, what I could say early on, I didn't think artists engaged necessarily. I just thought they just go in their studio, they make their art, and then they show it. But art is a collaboration. From my through sustaining my art career, I realized I don't work in a studio by myself, and that to sustain an art career, it is collaboration. I am always needing uh, how I can collaborate with others, supporting others, because in the end, the work that I'm producing it's a real group effort. And meaning group effort, including support from families and friends, and also support within yourself, knowing that what you may venture is unknown territory. And so, how do you, how, the challenge is like, if you're about to enter something unknown, maybe the thing that you think of is actually the barrier. It's is the post that's preventing you of moving forward because you believe this is how an artist is supposed to be making a living, or this is how an artist is supposed to be making art, or how art is supposed to be. I'm constantly learning to unlearn about what art is. In many ways, art can also be restricting, art can be judgmental, art could be authoritative, and art could also be abusive. And so I think for me to see, these are conversations that are happening today in contemporary dialogues. It's like, what we would often think of a museum presenting artwork is that, well, that's art. The museum is presenting art. That's the definition. Well, what would happen if we say, well, maybe the museum is not the authority on art? Maybe my own experience is as valid as a museum. And so artists, especially artists who don't get represented in museums or in other arts organizations, um, will have to look at those conversations like, well, am I going to be making art that doesn't necessarily look like myself? Or am I going to be making art that looks like what's in the museum? So unlearning what art is in museums, what art is in theory, actually challenge yourself. And maybe the ultimate challenge for an artist is really, who are you? Who am I? And so I've had to unlearn many things about myself. And that's what, in a very cliche way, this is how we grow. And so unlearning art is a big challenge. And that may be one that's one true form of like a genuine artist, is they are always challenging the convention of arts. They're always they're challenging themselves. And so
Wow,
I've,
amazing.
yeah.
So just to that point, how do you balance that? How do you balance that artistic expression versus being commercial and selling? I mean,
Hmm.
it's an element of a practicality in that.
Right.
Can you discuss
Yeah.
it?
So the profession of art can go in many directions. There's also many different forms of an artist in the profession. There are, in many ways, what we call commercial artists, artists who are living off the work that they're producing, right? And there's a system that helps them. Others maybe go into the graphic arts, so their artwork is producing income for themselves and sustaining themselves. There are artists who do fine arts, or sculptors who may have a gallery system helping them also move their artwork. And so that's one form of commercial artists. They're using uh, some system to have their work be shared. The other professional artists also have multiple jobs. Many contemporary artists today are also teachers. So they often teach, and now teaching is also very, it's not like every artist is a teacher. Those teaching positions are also very limited. And so, but they are an opportunity to be an artist, to sustain oneself as an artist is to also teach. And so I've become a teacher now for the last more than a decade now. And so for me, I've learned that as an educator, the other aspect of being an artist has actually come into full circle, and so when I talked about earlier that sharing is really an art form, and so being in a classroom and becoming a student myself and sharing what I've experienced, sharing my technical experiences, uh, but by no means am I going to be the authority on making art. If anything, I always encourage the classroom, the students, uh, to go through the process together. And so that to me has been a way of unlearning art. It wasn't about me being the expertise of my own artwork, but how do I know that I'm sharing art ideas, communicating theories and practice so that not only is it myself that's making art, but others are making art. And so everyone is metaphorically dancing together. And so to me, that's been inspiring. And so breaking that idea of that the artist in the studio working by themselves, that is a myth that I had to deconstruct as because of being an educator. And so my experience has always been I was always turned off by the instructor who was the know-it-all. And so I just had to just show up, and I was a good student. I would show up and essentially listen to what he said or they said, and they were the authority on art. And so it left very little voice for me. It didn't challenge me. So I could do that. Let's go ahead and, uh, copy the master, as they would say. But knowing now that the reference ought to come from yourself. So I've been learning that the students are their own masters and their challenges for themselves to not only be the best that they can. And one way to do that is knowing the technical aspect, doing the exercises, doing the hours and hours of practice. And so that at some point you really challenge yourself because you're trying to grasp onto something very complicated and complex, even as simple as a flower, right? And we all know that we take one thing that I've done is take a very holistic approach to even a representation of a botanical. And so that we think about science, we think about the climate, the environment. Art is science, right? And so those are the things that as visual artists that we're always approaching from every angle. And so as I approached this at every angle of this question, I've forgotten what the question was.
It was definitely the what you've already covered, and I think it's how do you balance that passion?
Mm,
What's
okay.
practical? What's
How
practical?
practical, right? So let me. So it's being to sustain oneself as an artist, one does have multiple jobs. I am a visual artist. I have a gallery that represents my work. I'm also an educator. I teach in college. I also and work at a museum. I am an exhibition designer. And every now and then I do theater. And so for me as an artist, how do I share my story? And so it doesn't come in one form. And so that to me is a definition of contemporary artists today. And you could even say it's not just artists, but you could say any industry, most industries, that they are multifaceted. You know, they talk about a portfolio. It's interesting that a portfolio is diverse, which is strong. And so just like an artist, a portfolio that's diverse and maybe even taking a holistic approach in finding the values of areas that you may feel that you feel connected with, engaged with, and that challenges yourself and others. So those are, you know, an industry that thinks about diversity and portfolio. A visual artist also thinks about their portfolio in the same way. I don't know if that answered the practical part, but I do know that as an artist, uh, you know, multiple jobs are not defined just in a studio.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
And what sacrifices have you had to make as in having a career in the arts?
Um, I'm very fortunate position to say um, the sacrifices that have been all worth it, you know, for me to be where I am today. Very fortunate to be able to share my stories, to engage with uh, other artists and other communities outside the art world too. Um, and so some of the sacrifices, see, that's a tough one for me to answer. That's a tough one. I mean, uh, you know, I think when you engage in the arts, uh, yeah, I don't know if I have an answer for what are the sacrifices. I'm not sure. I'm not really sure because I'm very fortunate that I am making art. Um,
And it sounds like it's all been a part of your journey,
yeah.
and that you've accepted whatever it comes your way and made the best use of it.
And
As
I
a
think, mhm. And I think also, yeah, sacrifices also are setbacks. Sacrifices is also failed attempts. Sacrifices have been it didn't work out at the moment. Uh, a sacrifice is also like not seeing the bigger picture, you know? So those are the things that I probably had to sacrifice early on that now I'm hoping to unlearn even more. And that's the part that's the growth that has to happen. And even I'm trying to unlearn sacrifice as much as I'm trying to unlearn art. So, what is sacrifice and what is art? That's where I am today. And so, as an artist, I'm hoping to use my technical experience, my art theories, my form of communication to hopefully share what I'm thinking about what art is, or what I'm thinking about what is real sacrifice. What are the real sacrifices of being an artist? There are sacrifices in starting a business. There's sacrifices in committing to yourself. And so, and those come in many, many forms. They come in forms of with other engagements with others and relationships and you know, conversations and dialogues are always going to be uh, challenged. They're always going to be, they're going to be organic. They're not going to be very straightforward. Um, Artists don't like to draw straight lines. Um,
Yeah, you talked a little bit about your involvement, and can you talk about your um, the relationship your parents might have had with your art? You know, were
mhm.
they encouraging? Were they did they let you move on your own way? What impact did they have, and what um, what do you think they could have said to you that would have encouraged you or helped you along?
My parents were, my father was a military. He was in the military, and my mother was a school teacher. And so, they probably saw early on as a young student how I was really engaged with art, making art, and to the point where they had to give in. That's because I did sacrifice maybe not going out on a out with friends or doing other things because I was making art. I was making art to the point where they saw it and they saw that I wasn't doing it to show them. I wasn't making art to show, oh, see, I could do this. I wasn't showing them to say, this is what I want to do. I wasn't showing them. I was probably showing myself. And so I give them a lot of credit for seeing that they saw in me that I was putting the sacrifice for myself. So I got 200% support from my parents. And to me, I was very fortunate. And and part of it is that's willing to ask yourself where how much you want to take this. And like every parent are hoping that, a young student will be immersed in something that they're so passionate about, or they're just, it becomes them. And, you could never tell that. So they were definitely, they weren't discouraging me to pursue art. I mean, I think for one, I mean, there was a moment when my dad said, well, maybe you could study architecture. and, um, and I said, well, architects are artists too. I said, yeah, maybe. So, um, but I also know being a painter is an architect and understanding form. You know, being a dancer is an architect and finding uh, lines and movement. And so I think for me, they were able to see uh, how much I invested time into my work, and they probably knew me enough that I was going to pursue this. And uh, you know, I probably asked myself that too. And of course, I always had doubts. Um, but I also was encouraged by them. That I was very supported by them. So I'm very fortunate in that regards. Um, the other factor is, and I don't know if but my brother and sisters also pursued. My sister's she's an oral surgeon. My brother is a civil engineer. All right. But their passion into what they were studying was in the same way I was passionate in what I was studying. And so they saw the values of it. And in many ways, uh, my dad is a philosopher, and I think he understood what I was creating, and he saw that I was sharing. And so I think that that was the encouragement that I got from them and the support from them. So
Thank you. That sounds fairly interesting and very pointed. Um, that you can imagine it was you. You were an artist at an early age, and it's wonderful that they embrace that.
yeah,
What type of advice would you give to parents who see that in their young artists now?
Hmm. Um, so as an artist, I would say to look at your child holistically and really think about how no, I'm not gonna discourage you not to give them piano lessons. I would probably encourage you to give them piano lessons. But for them to be a musician as a pianist, let's think more holistically. Maybe they become composers. Maybe they become oral surgeons, or maybe they are architects. But the arts is a form for them to think about where a young mind can go. And so, and the arts helps because arts keeps that attention and concentration to a high form. And for young students to try to achieve that high form of attention and to detail and focus, that can go anywhere, you know. And uh, and that's also what it's going to take to be an artist. It's the attention to details and to be able to communicate. They're trying to figure it out. I'm still trying to figure it out, right? And I'm still hoping that I could share and communicate ideas that are what I see after a storm. um, yeah, I would encourage to see to look more holistically as if their young student is really thinking about the arts and um, you know, it's arts and culture. Those I can't imagine how we can't how we cannot encourage that. I mean, I just would ask, arts and culture is something that we must encourage, and the technical and the sciences all will come into play if there's a true pursuit of that high form in the arts. And for young minds, young students to even think about creating an artwork, creating something into details, that's good exercise. That's really good exercise. Um, yeah, no matter if they're in high school or in college, you know, to pursue something, to create something, and you hope they're really they're asking the hard question of who they are, and that as a parent, we've done our part. If you could really ask them, or at least they're asking themselves, like, who am I? What am I doing? Yeah, that's what I would encourage parents if they start to see them making art. It's pretty amazing. It really is amazing for them to put that attention. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Can you talk about being an artist as an Asian American?
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really good question because I think that was something that even I myself was not sure how to pursue that. You know, I learned art from what I saw in in magazines and in museums, and so, and yeah, I didn't necessarily see my stories. I didn't see a house drawn in the sand. And so how did I like how did that how can I start, challenging myself? So those are one of the things that I probably one sacrifice is like I had to unlearn what art was and really go back to who I am. And so, and what are my experiences? What are my stories? And so, as an AAPI artist, that's a voice that still hasn't, in many ways, been really developed. I'm still developing it. I'm still bringing it out um, because the challenge is that art organizations and museums and the idea of art is really overwhelmingly uh, a very linear perspective, a very, in many ways, limiting perspective. And so I have to unlearn all that. I got to learn more about myself. And so those are the complexities of being an AAPI artist. And not only do you have to understand art history and art theories from what has been presented, and in many ways, we've all been molded to think about art. But then how do we create ourselves out of that mold? You know, um, it's a challenge. It really is a challenge. And at the same token, it can't be that hard to draw a house in the sand and to tell that story. How and why is it hard for me to tell that story? It's taking me this long to tell this story, you know? And it's for me to unlearn, like, nobody wanted to hear that story when I came out of art school. Nobody even wanted to hear my story because I didn't see other people like myself. And so there were some examples. David Madala, a contemporary artist, international artist, Manuel Ocampo. These were artists who were not only true to their identities, but they were challenging their identities. And then also in reflections of a global dialogue. And that to me, I felt very connected in that way. And so what is the idea of an AAPI? And is that just an American thing? Is that something like uh, and why is it just an American thing? That's the question. And those are the challenges. And so, yeah, we're fortunate to be able to have these conversations. And it's a really exciting time to be an artist, to bring out your perspectives that actually challenges what we've been taught of what art is. And so, yeah, that's what it means for me to hopefully find my voice. Like, who am I? Yeah. Um,
Thank you. This is great. This is it sounds like a continual growth and in being insightful and being in touch with who you are.
yeah, and that's a very challenging thing. And it's also a very challenging thing for parents to see, per se. Parents to see their young students, their young child, who are becoming adults and trying to find their own voice. And, you know, we've also been molded and taught how to parent. And one of the things I've learned from my own students and my own children is that I may not know the answer. And so, and they made me very comfortable about that. And that was, to me, they were really, uh, I was really proud of them for them to say that you may not know the answer. I felt okay, you know. It would be very different if they're really relying on me for the answers, relying for me to tell them what to do. I encourage them to be independent minded. I encourage them that I've been molded, and oftentimes my biases will show. My own fears and biases is not theirs. They don't need it. They have their own doubts and fears and confidence. They don't need mine. I could share my experiences, and that's the context it would ought to be in the conversation, but by no means am I even the authority of being a parent. This
Wow.
is it's an
That
art. This is an artist talking, by the way.
this is
So, um,
if just to close, how would you encourage artists? What advice would you give them to pursue their art? I think we discovered
mhm.
what it is uh, to be an artist, but how would you encourage them to move forward, and how do they move forward? What are the first three things that they should do?
Yeah. There's a couple things that there's two directions. One is to really use academics. Okay, that's I would say academic is networking. Academics is also one that sort of makes you commit to this industry in this art world. So I went and got my master's after I got my bachelor's 2 years after. I had 2 years, and then I went back and got my master's. But early on, I made that commitment that I'm going to do this thing. And so academics is one direction in which you can, you know, sort of check off like, hey, I'm going to do it. I'm going to commit to it. You know, it doesn't mean just because you go to law school, you become a lawyer, but maybe that's one direction. And yes, uh, I encourage people who want to pursue it further in looking at not only their bachelor's, but like other programs. And it doesn't have to be a master's of fine arts. Maybe it's another master's in education uh, or even an MBA, believe it or not. So even an artist can think outside the box. And so that's one direction as an artist is using academics. All right. And that's challenging, and that's a commitment too. So and I feel that if you make that commitment, um, it you have that, and hopefully it will sustain you long term. Okay. Um, and then the other direction is uh, yeah, don't worry about academics and try to create the work that you're doing, and you create your own school of thought. You're an artist. You have the ability to create your own school, your own master's degree, your own MBA, your own law school. So you can pursue it in a way that we could maybe learn. And so that's two directions. Either go pursue it academically or really pursue it in another form. Um, I every artist is different. Every student has different dispositions. They're all also in uh, moments in their lives that there are other factors. There's so many other variables that it's important to know like where they are. You know, is a is an artist ready to move to the big city? Are they do they want to go to art school in the city, or do they want to go to an art school to get their degree and maybe it's not in an urban setting? So those are things that you have to ask yourself. And so and where they are too. I think that's important. Where they are uh, personally, not necessarily technically, but where they are personally, and what would make them feel in a place that is safe and energizing, and hopefully a place that challenges you. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. Those are great directions. It will definitely help people move into the many different forms. Chris, thank you so much for your time. This has been a master class in digital art. So thank you so much for your time and your lessons and
well,
story.
well, thank you for letting me share some thoughts and ideas and having a conversation about art, which is a form that I pursue, is a form that I do have to find ways uh, to concentrate and give it attention. And something that you care for needs that. And so, and I appreciate all the support from arts organizations like CATS, who artists helps artists find their voices. So really, thank you. And we see that with all the programs that you all do. Really, really very fortunate.